Good morning, good mid-morning, and good noon to all who are joining from across the country. It's great to have you on our webinar today. We're going to get started in just a minute or so. We have a bunch of folks joining, 86 people in the room and a bunch hitting the waiting room. So stand by. I see Taylor Mag is in the house. Hey, Taylor, great to see you.
Hey, John.
Oh, Bob Lehrman from Israel. Bob, great to see you. Hello.
7 o'clock here.
7 o'clock. All right. Excellent. But you have late dinners anyway, right? So that's excellent. Rick Raffi is joining us from California. Hello, Rick. We will get started in just a second. Waiting room's still getting hit pretty hard with people coming in, so we'll try and accommodate that. Now we have a bunch of our intermediaries. Madeline, great to see you. Hello. Oh, Randy's here. Hey, Randy. Sorry I didn't see you. Great to see you. Hello. All right, well, I think I'm going to declare us ready to get started here. I know there are people still joining. We're up to about 126 people. We had about over 300 sign up for this webinar, so we know there's considerable interest in the executive orders that have come out from President Trump. Just to provide a little bit of context here, this webinar is one in a series that Apprenticeships for America is doing as part of a consultation with the field as we work to develop recommendations for the administration and how it might move forward with the executive orders, I should say. And this webinar is going to focus on the financing side of things. I was just in a meeting with Zach Boren at the Urban Institute. He says, show me your budget and I'll tell you your values. So we know that the budget is a critical part of thinking through some of the ambitions of the administration to expand apprenticeship in the United States and to ultimately grow apprenticeships, at least in the president's term, to 1 million active apprentices. So with that as background, I'm just going to ask Denise from the AFA team here to put up the slides. And I'm going to walk through a very brief set of introductory comments just to give you a sense of sort of the order of things here. Yeah, actually, you want to just go to the next slide, Denise. So we're going to spend about a third of our time together here with giving you some background, just so we're all sort of starting at the same level. And then what we're going to do for the balance of our time is really open this up for conversations. As I said, this is really intended to be a consultation with the field. And you'll see the structure of that consultation is really going to focus on different funding streams that are named in the executive order and how they might be deployed to advance the growth of apprenticeship in the United States. Of course, use the chat. Please do, and use the chat to introduce yourself. It'd be great to share with the team, with the group here, exactly who's on the call. But do use the chat to express any opinions. We save that chat. If you have something you want to say and share with the group, use the raise hands figure, just because there's a few too many of us to just jump in. And otherwise, keep yourself on mute. And then at the end of the session, we usually hang out for a little bit. So if you want to stay on and have a conversation about the conversation, we're happy to do that. Or maybe there's something you wanted to say that you didn't want to have recorded. Oh, yes, we're recorded. Didn't want to have it recorded. Please stick around and let us know what you're thinking. That's often a very helpful part of these processes. And as with all of our webinars, we will be sharing slides and a recording of the webinar to everyone who's registered. All right, let's move us forward here, Denise, if you could. All right, let's talk about the executive orders and what they say about funding. Next slide, please. So just to remind, there are two executive orders that are at play here and that reference apprenticeship, and these came out now about 3 weeks ago. So the first thing to note is that there is a general desire in these executive orders to speak to a more efficient allocation of resources in terms of our training and workforce development expenditure. And so certainly, I think that is telegraphing that the administration is interested in putting more money into some things and less money into other things. It named two things that it felt we should be giving less money to or putting less money into, and that is the Job Corps program and the Senior Executive Service Corps. I think I've got the name right. But in general, there's a push to sort of put money into more high value, high return activity. And there was a proposal in the executive order to combine all the WIOA dollars into a block grant, a Make America Skilled Again grant that would go out to the states with an expectation that at least 10% of that block grant would be spent on apprenticeship activity. And then in addition, looking to the other department at play here, the Department of Education, there was a named desire to have better access to apprenticeships through the Perkins, the financial and federal financial aid programming. Again, details pretty scarce. So part of the executive order is to develop a plan for how the government would do this. And part of our work today and over the course of the next few weeks is to develop recommendations as to what should be in that plan. I will also just say on the artificial intelligence executive order, there was a specific call out to look at apprenticeships as a tool for advancing skill building in AI occupations, and a desire to engage, as you can see here, industry organizations and employers to be part of registered apprenticeships in these occupations. So just to note that there's opportunities here to think about how we might deploy the apprenticeship model in that space, and how that might be, how then we might access funding to be able to support that. Next slide, please, Denise. About a week after the executive orders came out, the Office of Management and Budget released what's called a skinny budget. This is not if you remember from, years past, there would be these like telephone books of federal budgets. This is a 40 or 50-page document, so not exactly skinny, but a lot skinnier than those telephone books. That lays out the president's objectives around WIOA. So the Make America Skilled Again grants are referenced there. The desire to reduce expenditure for targeted Department of Labor programs is named there. The notion that 10% of these MASA grants would be allocated for apprenticeship is there. And there's an explicit call out to using federal work study dollars for career-oriented opportunities. Apprenticeship is not named, but career-oriented opportunities to improve employment outcomes for students. And then I think importantly, there's also a named desire in the skinny budget to eliminate adult education funding and to reallocate those dollars to other innovative workforce-aligned and apprenticeship-focused activities. So you can see here, the setup is both, significant ambitions around apprenticeship and a desire to prioritize apprenticeship over and above, I would say, most other workforce development, maybe even most other education activities. But then a desire to reallocate resources from other pots into apprenticeship in order to fund that. I will also say that it's almost certain that the skinny budget was written as the executive orders were coming out, and so I think there may be a little bit of left-hand, right-hand stuff going on here. As I often caution with anything from any presidential administration, it's important to look beyond the first announcement to think through what's the longer-term play here. Denise, next slide. So we're going to turn now to sort of where are the opportunities and challenges, and we actually have a guest speaker who's joining us at very last minute. So Taylor, we're just couldn't be more pleased to have Taylor Mag, who's a longtime friend and partner with Apprenticeships for America, now Director of Workforce Policy at Jobs for the Future. And Taylor's going to provide a few thoughts on where there might be opportunities to think about apprenticeship funding as it relates to the executive order. Taylor.
Well, John, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited AFA is hosting these conversations with the field. It's so important right now. So looking forward to hearing folks' remarks after John and I give this brief overview. Clearly from the executive orders and what we saw with the president's skinny budget priorities, there's a huge focus on better alignment across federal workforce programs to encourage high quality education and training opportunities, inclusive of course, apprenticeship. I wanted to talk today on how apprenticeship currently is being promoted across other federal policies like Perkins, which is the federal legislation over our CTE system in this country, as well as the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which is the legislation over our public workforce system. So there are opportunities that currently exist today, but there are a lot of challenges. So I think it's worth noting how these funds are going to be leveraged and how effective they will be if that is the goal of the current administration. John, I'll start with Perkins because that was just the order on the slide, and then I'll go to WIOA. But of course, these policies are trying to be more coordinated and related. So there's a lot of connection points across the two. Perkins, as I mentioned, is related to career and technical education across the country, serving secondary and post-secondary students. Right now, there's roughly $1.4 billion in state formula grants that are going to states, but it's really left up to states on how to administer those funds. So you see some states doing a 50-50 split between post-secondary education and K-12. Others have different percentages. Some goes all to one system, one to the other. So it's really up to states to determine and create that flexibility to meet their needs. Technically, the term registered apprenticeship is not in CTE statute to date. That's something maybe in a future reauthorization we can discuss to make sure that that definition and language is in there. But one thing that it does is that the Department of Education, OCDE specifically, which oversees CTE, has confirmed that registered apprenticeship programs do meet the definition of high quality CTE and can be supported through Perkins funding. So even though it's not in statute, funds can be used to support registered apprenticeship. However, to date, we haven't seen as much of that because we know apprenticeship is expensive and takes a lot of capacity. And our CTE system also is tasked with other areas of focus. And again, states administer, but it's really based on local needs assessment focused on dual enrollment, credentials of value, as well as work-based learning. Of course, apprenticeship relates to all three of those critical pieces and creates pathways. But again, it's really hard for communities who already are being strapped to implement CTE effectively to also offer apprenticeship through the system. So we haven't seen the uptake that I think we'd want the current system as it is. That being said, there is opportunity there. And one of the things that we're hearing the administration really be interested is how to leverage national initiatives through Perkins, which receives Department of Education around 7.4 million for national initiatives, how those dollars can be leveraged to support apprenticeship work across the country. And so that's just something to think about, not only the state funds where states could focus through local needs assessments and creating apprenticeship opportunities, but also where there's opportunity at the national level and some flexibility in funding to support apprenticeship expansion. Now on to WIOA, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, but we'll just we'll just say WIOA for purposes of time. WIOA similarly is only receives $3.3 billion across the funding for the main state formula grants across all 50 states. So only 3.3 billion that is going to, and this is the primary funds for employment, training assistance, especially for adult workers and job seekers, for young people who are disconnected from school and work, and of course, dislocated workers. So not only are these funds limited, they are serving a lot, trying to serve a lot of people and people who are facing barriers to employment. And as I mentioned, this 3.3 is across all 50 states. And I think now we have roughly 550 workforce boards that are all drawing down on these resources. So the funds don't go very far and are spread pretty thin. I will say, though, currently within WIOA, especially Title I, which is most focused on that education and training component, in a recent study from Department of Labor, not so recent, but most recent, they found that these funds were only 1% of these funds were supporting apprenticeship, which just shows how limited WIOA is able to provide the capacity and resources to truly support apprenticeship models on the ground, even if it's allowable through the law and is one of the intended education and training components of the system. It's really difficult. And again, only 1 to 2% of funds of WIOA are going towards apprenticeship. I also will flag on a more positive note, I will say the Title I youth funds that again are formula and going to all states do now require, as of a couple years ago, that 20% are used for work experience programs. I saw, I think in the chat that New America was on the call today, and they've done a lot of great work on helping to lift that up for states. That with this really demonstrates like the focus on youth work-based learning and how Title I funds for youth can be leveraged to support youth apprenticeship and registered apprenticeship, depending obviously on the young person's age and where they are and interacting in the system. So I just want to call that out, that while there are opportunities and it is allowable, of course, to support apprenticeship through the system, funds are limited, and to date, very little has been done. John, I'd be remiss if I didn't do a plug for WIOA reauthorization conversations that I know AFA is having, as well as other partners on the call. Last Congress, bipartisan, A Stronger Workforce for America Act, another acronym, ASWA. So we're adding another one to the call today. But that bill also highly encouraged, I think more than ever, apprenticeship through the workforce system. Through creating a youth apprenticeship readiness grant program as part of H-1B funds. So it'd be mandatory spending, and it would go to helping youth have access to these opportunities. It also created, in addition to the current reserve fund in WIOA, that's 15% for states, it would create some other funds around critical industry funds, sector partnership and career pathways fund that would really encourage employer-led training efforts with a huge highlighting of apprenticeship as part of those statewide employer partnership and efforts. Last thing I'll say, and I'll put this in the chat, but NGA and Harvard's Project on Workforce came out with an awesome report on how governors are leveraging their current WIOA reserve funds to support innovative education and training that's truly employer-led and aligned. And it was found that more and more governors are using these reserve funds to support apprenticeship models. So I think, John, to summarize, because I know there's a lot there, and happy to go deeper as we talk with the folks on the call on any of like the specific elements of these pieces of legislation that should be discussed. I think the general theme is like, yes, there's opportunity to incentivize and have more apprenticeship across our current workforce programs, especially Perkins and WIOA. However, funds are limited. And if we're looking to truly reach scale, we can't just rely on current appropriations to get there. We need additional federal and state dollars to truly move the needle and reach the goals that AFA has been advocating for some time. So really excited to be talking. I think it's exciting to see the administration want to encourage more of these high quality opportunities across systems. But again, I think we need to put the money behind it to make sure it actually happens.
Excellent. Thank you so, so much. That was a rapid fire, intense delivery of meaty information. Thank you so much, Taylor, for joining us today. And then let me also just say in the chat, there was a request if you can provide a site for that DOL study on the Title I funds, that would be great. You can just throw that in the chat. And the Harvard study too, maybe while you're at it, if that's something you can throw in. And we'll try and make sure that also goes out in our follow-up. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Taylor, for joining us. And we'll have a chance to process some of that in just a second here. But if you can just put up the slides one last time here, Denise, I'd appreciate it. I want to just suggest a couple of parameters for our conversation going forward. So next slide, please. And next. So first off, let's just name the scale of the problem that we have here in the United States, which is that we have significantly underspent in apprenticeship. If you've hung around with Apprenticeships for America for any amount of time, we've probably trotted out a slide that looks like this at least once, maybe twice, because when we compare ourselves to the kinds of spending that we see in other countries that have really grown and developed a robust apprenticeship system, we're just not on the map. And so our challenge is really to raise up that in order to meet the president's ambitions, we are going to need to see significant increases in funding to be able to support apprenticeship. Next slide, please. And when we look at the apprenticeship system, we really, and by the way, there would be many ways to cut this, so this is just what we're offering for today. We really see sort of three buckets of consideration here. The first is we just have to acknowledge that there's, the biggest costs around apprenticeship are being paid by employers, and that's the apprenticeship wages, the on-the-job training costs, staff, time, equipment, the cost of mentoring. Those costs are, for the most part, covered by employers. That being said, we know that in order to induce employers for that level of spending, it may be helpful to offer incentives or inducements, tax credits, that sort of thing. And so we're going to come back to that in just a second here, but we'll name that as sort of bucket one. The second bucket are the costs that are, partially met or at least could be met by existing federal and state National Apprenticeship Office funding streams. And in particular, we think of this as the cost for related technical instruction. So many of us have been able to find resources in the local community college or from rarely, but a little bit from workforce boards or from other sources to be able to cover some of those costs. The thing that we think is one of the major impediments to the growth of apprenticeship is this third bucket that is not covered by any costs that are out there, or any funding stream that's out there. And that is the cost of administering programs, the startup costs that relate to apprenticeship, and the cost of supportive services, the cost of recruiting employers. All of those costs we feel like are often left for organizations to sort of scramble and try and figure out how to pick those up. And those of us who have access to joint training funds, might be able to use some of those funds for that purpose. But by and large, the rest of us are trying to cobble this together on the side. And so, or hide it, or hide it in other workforce development budgets. And so I think our task also is going to be to look at, how might we pitch solutions to this funding problem. And again, if you've hung out with AFA any amount of time, you know that we talk a lot about pay for apprenticeship as a possible funding model for these costs. Denise, next slide, and then I think we can put the slides away. So what we're going to suggest for the balance of our conversation today is a sort of three-part conversation. Arbitrarily, we'll give 10 minutes or so to each part of the conversation, talking about first the WIOA funding streams and asking for, number one, general reactions and any experience that you've had using these funding streams, and then any suggestions you have that we should be thinking about for these funding streams. Second would be the Department of Education related funding streams. Here speaking specifically of Perkins, federal student aids, that's Pell and other student aid that's out there, and federal work study. And then finally, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about these new funding mechanisms that might be considered, including different kinds of employer incentives and pay for apprenticeship. With that, Denise, I'm gonna, if you want to take down the slides, that would be great. And I'm gonna actually cold call, if I can, Randy Wolf, because Randy, you put, if it's okay, if you're not able to talk, just wave me away. You put in the chat that I think you said WIOA is worthless. I'd love to hear that perspective, and what was your experience, and do you have any ideas on how we might fix it?
I have no ideas how we might be able to fix
Okay,
it.
fair enough.
And I'm only bringing it up because I shouldn't say everybody, there's certainly a lot of people who recognize this. And maybe it's particular to certain industries. I don't know if there are industries, particularly those that are union organized, who have more success accessing WIOA. But in our largest programs where we do have more administrative capacity to deal with, the paperwork and all that, over and over again, the conclusion is it is not worth the effort. That the time they put into the paperwork and the reporting and all of that versus the 50 cents per person, 75 cents per hour it's just not worth it. A, B, because you have to go through the workforce development boards who have their own priorities, some of which go back 30 years, and they're not open to new and emerging industries, and they're not open to low-wage industries, even though they're providing essential services. John, you know where I stand on that issue.
Absolutely.
So all of which adds up to every time we're talking to whoever and they go, well, there's WIOA funding. And then we go, come on. And basically the person goes, yeah, I know, but I have to say that. So I don't think it's just me being, nasty or, obstructive or whatever. I think it's a real problem if that is still looked at as our major source of funding.
Can I
Ethan, I want to bring you in
off
just a second, but is there anyone else who has a sort of similar comment or anything to build on Randy's comment?
Yeah, I'd like to build off of Randy's comment. In the teacher space, in the teacher apprenticeship space, there's this misnomer, misconception that, once you apply to be a registered apprenticeship program, this pot of money just becomes available to you. And we have actually found that it is easier for what we call like little A apprenticeship programs that are running but are not registered, to access WIOA funding. It's easier to access the streams that already exist, IWT, OJT, ITA, than it is to access funding through WIOA for RAPs. Obviously, both of them have massive amounts of paperwork and compliance associated with them, but I think the conversation that we're all having here is one that I am wrestling with every single day, which is the juice worth the squeeze. And it is different in every state and with every workforce board, which makes addressing talent pipelines nationwide a nightmare.
Excellent. Josh, you want to jump on this? I know you had a comment on WIOA in the chat as well.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting back and forth microphone. Randy's absolutely correct, and so is the previous commenter. I didn't see her name, but one other thing that as we look to expand apprenticeship into new areas, particularly like teacher or nurse or any of that kind of stuff where there are degrees associated, there's also built-in limitations because the WIOA dollars are so small that a lot of, at least I know in Alabama and in several other states, I don't know about a lot, but in several states that I've talked to, they're specifically prohibited from spending those WIOA dollars on programs that are associated with degrees because they see the degree program as being too expensive, even if it's an apprenticeship program where the employer, in our case, is paying the bill for the cost of that training. The flat rule is, hey, we don't approve programs for any WIOA funding if it's a 4-year degree type program. So yes, there's not enough money there. Yes, it's too much paperwork. Everything Randy said all across the board, every single employer I have, virtually every employer I have says juice ain't worth the squeeze. But then one other new restriction that has kind of come up for us as we've started going towards degree bearing apprenticeships has been this idea that nope, we just don't do degrees in WIOA because the money's already too tight and we can't afford it. And the fact that it's an RA doesn't really matter to them. So just wanted to add that.
Excellent. Ethan, you've been sitting off to the side here, so I want to bring you back into the conversation. Ethan, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Sean. Hello, everyone. Great conversation. I am very happy to be a part of it. So I would just piggyback on all the things that have been said about WIOA funding. And one additional point that I would bring up is, I think from a kind of sales perspective, if you will, engaging employers, the more clarity that we can provide employers with what the program will cost them, the better. And one of the issues that I personally have run across, and I know that many of my colleagues in the space have run across, is when you're engaging about something that is extremely variable from state to state, region to region, person to person, it becomes much harder to give an employer an exact cost of the program, implementing that program, providing RTI. And at the same time, I do want to acknowledge that we need to be able to fund supportive services for apprentices, especially if we're going to tap into a whole new wave of people in various industries. So I do want to recognize that, but also acknowledge that it makes the calculations for an employer a little bit harder and a little bit of a headache when there's so much variability.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that, Ethan. Just before we leave the WIOA conversation, we had a comment about using ITAs or customized job training dollars under WIOA. That maybe that is an avenue. And I'm just wondering, is there anyone else who has experience using those? What's worked, what's not worked? Any reaction on that? You could also put it in the chat if you're not able to speak. Anyone have anything to say on that?
John, can I add a question?
Taylor? Yeah, please.
No, I'm not offering an answer. I just want a question for the group too. In addition to ITAs, also incumbent worker training, because
Yeah,
in
the incumbent worker
study,
training. Yep.
I mentioned they were, obviously there's a lot, 20% allowable. And so are employers on this call, or those partnering, are they able to kind of leverage those dollars to support employers in offering those types of models internally? Sounds like from the chat, maybe not, but would also love to hear in addition to ITAs if any of the incumbent worker dollars are being leveraged to support apprenticeship.
I'll offer just a quick insight because we're knee deep into this. So we are a non-college degree technical program registered intermediary in cybersecurity. We're working with local workforce centers and trying to close the gap for RTI, as we are an RTI provider, using the incumbent worker training funds for employers. What we're finding, and I think this comes back to the note I put in the chat, the process across the board needs to be standardized. So we could move from market to market based on the employers we're trying to serve with the same rules of engagement. And it takes us so long just to figure out, for incumbent worker dollars in San Antonio, they just, I think, allocated about $6 million to incumbent worker training, and those are called ready to work funds. But over in Colorado, it's called a seed fund. So even the name of how we could draw on the association of the incumbent worker training funds is different from state to state and region to region. So if there was any way we could work together to help the system find a standard process, I think system's not broken. It just needs tightened up from a process standpoint.
Excellent. That's a helpful bit of feedback. We're always, we want to catalog what's not working. We also want to call out what is working or what could be working. And so appreciate that. All right. Not to say we have settled the WIOA problem in 10 minutes here, but we are going to move on, just in the interest of sort of covering the waterfront, so to speak, to some of the funding streams at the Department of Education. And by the way, please keep your comments going in the chat. Incredibly helpful. We will be mining those as we are working on recommendations back to the department and the White House on these executive orders. So thank you for that. So in the Department of Education, we're looking at sort of three, and there could be more, so feel free to bring in others, but three funding streams: the Perkins money, the federal student aid money, and then the federal work study money. It would be great again to hear of anyone who is successfully tapping these streams, or maybe unsuccessfully tapping these funding streams, and to hear a little bit your perspective and reactions on that. Anyone want to lead us off here? Perhaps one of our community college participants has got some experience braiding some of these funds into your apprenticeship work. Okay.
Hi.
Yeah, please. Amber,
Hi.
please jump in.
I think I want to make sure I understood your question correctly. So you're asking about braiding funds to support, maybe just using WIOA and other funding to support apprenticeships?
Specifically, whether that's the Pell or federal student aid or other kinds of federal student aid, Perkins or work study dollars.
Okay. So I'm in New Jersey, and one of the things that we've done to braid funding is we have had some success working with the workforce board, but like a lot of people have said, it's few and far between. It's by no means a place that I can go to fund all of our people. And then there's just a lot of rules, like one person couldn't be awarded because they had been working there for 6 months and 3 days, and the cutoff was 6 months, and all this kinds of stuff. So we do utilize that. We had a scaling apprenticeship grant that focused on manufacturing, that we were able to utilize that as well. And I know that there's other grants that have come out. I'm also on a scaling apprenticeship grant, or sorry, that was our old grant. We're on a strengthening community college grant that we're now trying to implement more in the cybersecurity IT area. But we've been lucky enough in New Jersey that there's also 2 grants that we've kind of been able to braid, which one is on pre-apprenticeship. I know this is more focused on apprenticeships, but we found that the best gateway has been to run a pre-apprenticeship and get them in to fill those new positions that employers need. So we have what's called a PACE grant. So the PACE grant, we actually are able to pay the tuition of our pre-apprenticeship students. And what's really nice is it also offers a tuition, or not just tuition, but also a stipend for the students. So we do a lot of recruitment from like at-risk populations. We work with a lot of nonprofits. So a lot of these people, they wouldn't be able to take these if there wasn't funding available. And it's also not something that companies have provided money for, because there's no guarantee they're going to get an employee at the end of it.
Right.
But we run what we call boot camps, but they're pre-apprenticeships, and it's been pretty successful. And utilizing those funds, we've been able to continue to run those programs and keep them full for the most part for the last couple of years, because we've had this ongoing funding. And then in addition to that, they also have a Gains grant, which is specifically a grant for apprenticeships in non-traditional areas.
Yeah. And that's state money, right? If I'm remembering right.
I think it's state that goes to it's state money. Yeah. I think it comes from the federal government, then goes to state. So I don't know what other
through
states.
the governor's office. Got it.
Yeah. So I don't know if it goes to other like states like this, but the idea is a student could potentially utilize like the PACE grant, go through the program, get hired by a company, and then use the Gains grant to then fund them, because we as a community college are the RTI providers in 99% of the apprenticeships we work with. So then that pays for the RTI piece of it. Although I still feel all the pain about, even with that, companies are like, it's too much work finding a mentor, and all these other things. So we are utilizing that, and our current foray, and I don't know if anybody can comment on this, is again in New Jersey, we have a NJ Gives grant that's actually through our FAFSA. So this is what we're trying to do for our IT boot camp. Cybersecurity is one of the areas that this grant can help cover. So we're trying to now navigate the students actually filling out a FAFSA for a non-credit program and then applying for this grant, which would give them $2,000 per year for up to 2 years. And hopefully that could pay for the pre-apprenticeship that we are running in cybersecurity. We haven't been successful yet, but that's kind of where we're trying to go. It's just kind of at the point where we're trying to find anything that we can to help fund, like I said, these pre-apprenticeships to then support them going into the apprenticeships and utilizing either the gains or the WIOA money that we have available to pay for the apprenticeship RTI piece of it. So I hope that
Amber,
all makes sense.
thanks for raising that. Actually, you raised one thing. If I can just jump back into WIOA land really briefly, and then we'll pick up the hands here, which is there's an impression, I think a correct impression, that money that the governor, WIOA money at the governor's office level has been more helpful for apprenticeship than in the local boards. And I'm just wondering, given the administration's inclination to put more money to the states in block grants, or essentially, and actually, and ASWA's would put more money in under the governor's control as well. I'm wondering what's been the experience there. Has anyone successfully tapped those dollars? How has that worked? Any reactions on that? And then, Brandon, are you on this?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, everyone. My name is Brandon. I'm with the state of Georgia, and I work at a community college system that's also the WIO administrator, which is, at the state level. But yes, the state reserve is very helpful. But I'll say one thing. It's because there's less. There's a lot more flexibility that can be done with that. But the challenge that we have, and I think the most of the country has, is the allotments for WIOA, with the exception of a handful of states, have been rapidly decreasing because of unemployment rates. And so for us in our state reserve, we were able to do some really cool things about 5 to 10 years ago. Now, with the state's allotment going down about 40%, it's really focused on just meeting the basic requirements to keep one-stops operational so that we're compliant with the law. And so, yes, I do think that there's a lot more flexibilities when you have things at the state level. But it's harder and harder to do that.
Right. Thanks for that comment. And
Sure.
Joan, I just also want to acknowledge some of the reporting requirements on WIOA are pretty onerous, and not great systems for tracking that. It just raises the overhead. Kim, you've been hanging out with your hand up for a little bit here, so I'm going to bring you into the conversation.
Thank you. So I represent a community college in rural Northeast Nebraska. And when we start working with a student, whether they're, high school age, traditional college age, incumbent worker, when we start onboarding them into our apprenticeship program, one of the first things we have them do is go through the FAFSA process. And we've had a lot of luck with a lot of our apprentices do qualify for some Pell funding. So I always tell our employers, before you start spending some money on paying for the cost of their tuition and things like that, absolutely utilize those Pell dollars and other scholarship funds they may have been awarded, and then you can pick up what's left over. The other thing that we're just starting to explore, and I don't know exactly how it's going to work out yet, as a college, we're starting to begin accepting SNAP education and training dollars. And so there's been some discussions around how do we braid that with our apprenticeship programs. I think right now the working theory is they would have to go through their SNAP education and training almost as like a front-loaded apprenticeship before we get them hired. Because if they would start their work at the same time, more than likely they're going to be kicked off SNAP and then they don't have the benefits and all of those things. But strategically on the front end, thinking maybe we use that SNAP ENT training time as like a pre-apprenticeship or whatever you want to call it, that then later leads them to a full-blown apprenticeship.
And,
So
and I know Jobs for the Future and a policy paper you just put out was calling for some forbearance around apprenticeship wages in some of those calculations to be able to support that. So Taylor, anything you want to add to that?
No, Kim, I'm just so excited you raised that because I think that's something we've talked about a lot, that even if some of these public programs don't have the capacity to be the intermediary or offer a full-blown registered program, how are they getting people prepared for those opportunities and making sure those pre-apprenticeship and pathways into apprenticeship models are high quality, valuable, and even, you know, if they decide not to go into a full-on apprenticeship, they're getting a credential of value that can still get them a good job. So I think I'm so glad you raised it. And John, thank you for plugging the brief, and happy to talk more with folks about those opportunities as well.
Excellent. Is there anybody out in this group that is successfully using federal work study dollars in their apprenticeship or pre-apprenticeship work? Anybody doing that right now? Yeah, my experience is that this is pretty rare, but it's an option that could be available under a slightly reconceived federal work study program plan. Okay, we'll watch that space as possible. We'll certainly be looking for opportunities to think about that. Is there anyone from California that's using the now I'm forgetting the name, the student work study, state student work study program for apprenticeship? Anyone on the call who's using that pot of money? Okay, all right, we'll come back on that. Oh, Madeline, yeah, can you jump in on this?
I can't jump in on that, but when we're talking about federal dollars, one thing we've noticed in the last few years is that HHS is putting forward grants that is requiring an apprenticeship component and helps fund those apprenticeships as well. And, you know, because I only work in the healthcare space, I'm familiar with what's going on with HHS. But I'm wondering if there's other agencies too that are putting forward grant opportunities that require apprenticeship, like HRSA is doing.
For sure. Yeah. And so, yes, and I think it's great to call those out. You know, we know that the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, there's a variety of folks who have baked apprenticeship into other kinds of grant actions. You're good to remind us that we should be looking beyond the funding streams named in the EOs. That's great. All right, I am going to move us along to this third bucket, which is really looking at how do we fund the absolutely essential infrastructure that allows apprenticeships to move forward, the marketing work, the administrative work, the supportive services work, all those pieces that aren't related instruction and aren't necessarily on the job instruction. As you all know, Apprenticeships for America has been championing a pay for apprenticeship or pay for success approach. We are seeing some of this play out in the states, where states are using different kinds of formula funding to be able to get dollars on a per apprentice level out to apprenticeship programs. Thinking especially of California and the Apprenticeship Innovation Fund there. But we track in perhaps a dozen states different kinds of pay for apprenticeship efforts that are out there. And apparently, we will learn soon, in the State Apprenticeship Expansion Grant, we know that there was an opening for states to expand pay for apprenticeship funding mechanisms. And we know that there are a couple of states that put in proposals for that. So we'll see what comes of that. I'm interested in hearing from anyone here who has been able to access one of those funding streams. If you could tell us what worked about it, what didn't work about it. If you have a contract that is paying you a certain amount per apprentice, and then maybe you don't have to do some of that other budget reporting and so on, it'd be great to hear from you. Anyone on the call who's got that experience? I know Randy, I think left. Randy, I know actually is a customer of the ESEP of the AIF program in California. But anybody else who's got that background? Madeline, have any of your programs been able to access either the Apprenticeship Innovation Fund or other sort of formula-based funding systems for apprenticeship?
No, and we've tried.
Brandon's jumping in here. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, so in Georgia with our SAFE grant,
Georgia,
we
great.
we did set up a pay for performance structure, both through our colleges, and then previously we've also done it with intermediaries on a previous grant. We found it to be very helpful. The challenge was, even though it's still pay for performance, we still had to do performance reporting on all of the federally funded apprentices, and so that was still a big barrier. So if in recommendations moving forward, and I'll say this as a plug, I think that instead of trying to put apprenticeships, fund apprenticeships through a WIOA structure, it's worth making the argument that there needs to be a separate apprenticeship allotment of funding that is administered, and in doing that, making sure that the performance requirements and reporting requirements are accurate to what an employer in apprenticeship would be willing to do.
Excellent. And thank you for sharing that. I know Georgia has really stepped up on this, that there's sort of more activity in this space. So we've been watching that with some interest. This is probably a follow-on side conversation.
Of course.
Well, I may follow up with you on that.
Sounds
That's
good.
great. Rick from California, Creating Coding Careers. Hello.
Hey, Creating Coding Careers is definitely taking advantage of AIF. I mean, AIF is exactly the model that we want, where we're trying to advocate for moving on from grants so you have sustainable, scalable funding. And there were a lot of issues with the initial payments going out, and it's retroactive. So it can be a year later or more based on how it actually has been rolling out. But California takes a lot of pride in that system, and we're trying to leverage that as much as possible with employers to activate and be excited about it.
Thanks for sharing that. Barbara.
Yes, hi. I am with Randy at ESEPS, and
great.
yes, we we have taken advantage of the AIF funding, and we love that model. Pay for performance is, I think, the way to go in this situation. Although, yes, I agree with Rick. It took about a year to get our funding back the previous year, and we haven't seen our funding come in yet from this year. But we really like that model, and we are redispersing that funding to our employer partners for use for a variety of things. So great model, and I hope that they continue to fund that program, because we have not heard if it's going to be funded next year. So
yeah,
yes.
a lot of us are working on that question. So yeah, I appreciate that sentiment, Barbara. Let me turn to another tool in our toolkit, funding toolkit, which is the employer tax credit. And again, across the states, more than a dozen states have different kinds of tax credits. There has been floated the idea of a federal tax credit. There's actually legislation pending in Congress to try and bring that forward. The review of the report out on the current big tax consideration does not currently have anything around apprenticeship tax credits in it. I think we would be the only ones that didn't get a tax cut or a tax break from that bill. But I am curious as to whether or not folks have been able to incorporate that into their programming, into their conversations with employers, and what's been the impact of that, if anything. Anyone want to speak to the tax credit question?
Hi, everybody. My name is Allison Lewis. I work for a large group sponsor of apprenticeship, and we have a bunch of employers all across the United States. I think we're up to like 42 states. So John, exactly as you said, every state is different. So one of the best things I can do is I point all of our employers when they're first onboarding or orienting. I point them to, the Department of Commerce or the Department of Labor. Sometimes it's different departments within each state. Where we've had a lot of success has been in Maryland. Chris McClarion, the director there, is absolutely great. He's done an excellent job with disseminating information and hosting webinars and things like that. And so that is a huge thing that drives enrollment in the states where there are apprenticeship tax credits. We see more employers hiring people from at-risk groups, or actually hiring like people that are completely new to the industry when there is actually funding. And in the states where there's not as much tax incentives or things like that, sometimes employers won't take the risk of, really investing in training for people that aren't incumbent workers. And so it would be so helpful, from my opinion, or from my point of view, for our program, if there was a federal tax credit. And that seems like something that could be, with all of this funding being talked about and how it's going to be disseminated, that seems like a really broad way to actually just give registered apprenticeship, and the end users, or the paying customers, often the employers, a good way to pay for it.
Excellent. Madeline, you want to jump in on this?
I feel like tax credits are hard to use in the healthcare space because so many of the healthcare employers are nonprofit.
Right.
So it makes no difference for some industries. For some industries, I think it's fabulous.
Yeah.
But in healthcare, we have very few employers that can utilize any sort of tax credit.
And I think in Colorado, there was actually a provision for nonprofit organizations to be able to get an equivalent amount in a grant.
Yes.
So that's certainly a very helpful sort of nuance to be able to understand in those kinds of programs. Excellent. Ethan, on tax credits, any comment?
Yeah, just reflecting pretty much the same argument I made in my last comment, which is I think providing employers with, even if it's within a given state, some level of clarity as to the degree of funding that they can expect on a per apprentice basis is really, really helpful in getting a sale over the line, to give them a very clear number. If you know what the cost of let's say RTI will be and what the wage that they'll pay will be, if you can say on top of that, we can guarantee you in Massachusetts, $4,800 per apprentice, up to $100,000 per year. Those kinds of numbers are really powerful. And to Madeline's point, definitely doesn't apply to every employer, but when it does apply, I would argue even in small amounts, it can be very effective.
That's excellent. That's excellent. I just want to note in the chat that Kansas apparently also has a similar provision that allows for direct grants to nonprofits who can't take advantage of tax credits. And Josh, I also want to just call out, we know that there's very significantly different impact depending on the relative tax burden of particular states. I'll also just say, I think your $5,400 payment for apprenticeship is a pay for success payment. So that would be my view. But we could have more conversation on that later. Lonnie, I'm going to bring you in for the last word, and then we're going to wrap up here.
Lonnie, you're on
we're
mute.
not hearing you. I think you might still be on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I said as we've expanded beyond IT into these 5 other sectors here in the state of Arkansas and beyond, it's been pretty clear that across more than probably 220 employers, of those that are in the medium and small category in Arkansas, that state tax credit has been extremely meaningful, right? I would say larger organizations, it's kind of negligible, but there are several that probably survived or basically had this as an additional part of their cost savings relative to doing registered apprenticeship, that you just can't even put a price tag on that as what it's meant for those companies. So I do believe that has an impact, and it's a strategy that's over and above, regularly what we've been able to support employers. And I think that's why that employer engagement thing that we talk about a lot has been a success point for us, right? I think it's we've established a method by which that communication to employers is in their terms, right? It's in the language of business and not the language of government or an agency, or we're a nonprofit, but we talk to them about what is going to benefit them, and it's really been a difference maker. So
Lonnie, thank you so much for that comment. That's very helpful. We'll certainly be speaking to these kinds of opportunities in our recommendations back to the administration. I just want to shameless plug, put in for our next session on the executive orders, which is going to be next week on Wednesday, where we'll be focusing on some of the opportunities for national occupational standards, something that was called out in the artificial intelligence executive order. So please do join us for that. And continue to participate in other AFA events. They're all available on apprenticeshipsforamerica.org under the events tab. And we welcome you to our regular course of webinars and so on beyond some of our policy work. We anticipate wrapping up our consultation process in early June and working towards a set of recommendations, which we'll be sharing through a sneak peek with AFA members later that month. So stay tuned for information on that. I want to thank everyone for participating, the 130, 40, 50 of you that were part of the conversation. Really appreciate it and looking forward to continuing the conversation in future webinars. Thanks so much. And anyone who wants to stick around and chat afterwards, we'll be around for a few more minutes. Thanks.